The small music classroom buzzed with nervous energy as 20 students arranged their sheet music and adjusted their seats. Morning sunlight streamed through tall windows, dust particles dancing in the golden beams that fell across the polished wooden floor. At the front of the room stood Professor Anton Weber, a tall man with silver-streaked hair and piercing blue eyes that seemed to notice every mistake, every hesitation. The Vienna Academy of Music prided itself on excellence, and Professor Weber embodied this standard with unwavering strictness. His reputation preceded him. Former students spoke of his harsh critiques in hushed tones, but also of how his demanding nature had shaped them into true artists. "Today we will begin with Chopin," Professor Weber announced, his voice cutting through the whispers. "And please try to remember that Chopin requires both technical precision and emotional depth, something most of you failed to grasp last week." The students straightened their backs, eyes focused on their music stands, all except for one boy seated in the back corner, partially hidden behind a taller student. Thomas Reiner kept his head slightly bowed, his worn notebook balanced on his knee instead of proper sheet music. Thomas had arrived at the academy just 3 weeks ago, a scholarship student from a small village in the countryside. Everything about him seemed out of place in these hallowed halls. His second-hand clothes, his shy demeanor, and most noticeably, his lack of formal training. The scholarship had been awarded based on a recording that had somehow found its way to the Academy's admission board, a recording so impressive that they had overlooked his almost complete lack of formal education. Professor Weber pointed to a girl in the front row. "Lena, begin with the nocturne in E-flat major." Lena played beautifully, her fingers graceful and confident. When she finished, Professor Weber gave a curt nod, high praise from him. 2 more students performed, receiving varying degrees of criticism. "Now," Professor Weber said, his eyes scanning the room, "let's hear from someone new." His gaze landed on the back corner. "You, the scholarship student." Thomas looked up, his dark eyes widening. The classroom fell silent, all heads turning to stare at him. "Yes, you," Professor Weber continued. "Come to the piano." Thomas stood slowly, his chair scraping against the floor in the silent room. He walked to the grand piano at the front, aware of every eye following him. His faded blue sweater hung loosely on his thin frame, a stark contrast to the tailored outfits of his classmates. "What piece have you prepared today?" Professor Weber asked, though his tone suggested he expected little. "I was practicing the Mozart sonata in C major," Thomas replied, his voice barely audible. Professor Weber raised an eyebrow. "A rather elementary choice, but proceed." Thomas sat at the piano, took a deep breath, and began to play. His performance was technically correct but hesitant, his posture stiff with nervousness. When he finished, the room remained silent. "Adequate," Professor Weber said after a long pause, though lacking any real understanding of Mozart's intentions. "You play the notes but miss the music." He turned to address the class. "This is what happens when natural talent is not properly cultivated from an early age." A few students snickered, and Thomas's cheeks burned with embarrassment. Throughout the following weeks, Thomas tried to blend into the background, practicing late into the night in the empty rehearsal rooms when no one could hear his mistakes. He borrowed recordings from the library, listening intently with eyes closed, trying to absorb centuries of classical training through sheer determination. His fellow students largely ignored him, viewing him as an oddity, the poor boy who somehow got lucky. Only one student, a kind-hearted girl named Sophia, occasionally offered him a smile or a borrowed pencil when he needed one. One rainy afternoon, as autumn leaves swirled against the academy windows, Professor Weber entered the classroom with a particularly stern expression. "Today," he announced, "we will discuss the pinnacle of piano repertoire, pieces that separate true pianists from mere players." He walked slowly between the rows of students. Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 3 is perhaps the most technically demanding piece ever written for piano. It requires not only extraordinary skill, but a depth of understanding that takes years to develop. The students nodded respectfully. Even the most talented among them approached Rachmaninoff with reverence and caution. "I want each of you to study the first movement," Professor Weber continued. "We'll discuss its complexities next week, though I don't expect any of you to master it this term. Perhaps by your final year, the most gifted among you might attempt a performance." He walked to his desk and lifted a stack of papers. Here are copies of the score for those who don't already own it. I expect you all to familiarize yourselves with the piece, even if you cannot play it yet. As the papers were distributed, Professor Weber's gaze once again fell on Thomas, who sat quietly making notes in his worn notebook. "Mr. Reiner," he called out, causing Thomas to look up suddenly. "You seem distracted. Perhaps Rachmaninoff is too advanced for your consideration?" Thomas shook his head. "No, sir. I was just taking notes." A hint of a smile played at the corner of Professor Weber's mouth, but it wasn't kind. It was the smile of someone about to make a point. "Since you're so attentive, perhaps you'd like a special assignment." The room grew tense as students sensed the coming challenge. While your classmates study the piece, you will prepare to perform it. The first movement in its entirety 1 week from today. Gasps and whispers erupted around the room. Even the most advanced students wouldn't dare attempt a full performance of Rachmaninoff's Third with only a week's preparation. "Professor," Sophia interjected, "that's impossible. Even professional pianists spend months." "I am well aware of what professional pianists do, Miss Novak." Professor Weber cut her off sharply. "This is not a request open for debate." He turned back to Thomas. "Well, Mr. Reiner, do you accept the challenge? Or shall we take this as an admission that perhaps you don't belong at this academy after all?" Thomas looked around the room at the faces watching him with a mixture of pity and curiosity. He had never played Rachmaninoff's Third before. He had heard recordings, had marveled at its complexity, but to learn it in a week seemed an impossible task designed only to humiliate him. Yet something in Professor Weber's smug certainty of his failure ignited a spark within him. Thomas thought of the tiny church in his village, of the countless hours he had spent at its old upright piano, teaching himself to play by ear because there was no one to teach him to read music properly. He thought of his grandmother who had sacrificed everything to send him here. "I accept," Thomas said quietly. Professor Weber's eyebrows rose slightly, perhaps surprised by the lack of fear in the boy's voice. "Very well. 1 week from today, you will perform the first movement of Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 3 for the class. And to make it interesting," he paused, looking around the room, "if Mr. Reiner manages anything above complete failure, I will excuse the entire class from the term paper due next month." Now all eyes turned to Thomas with renewed interest. Some faces showed hope, others skepticism, but most reflected the certainty that they would indeed be writing that term paper. As class ended, students filed out, discussing the impossible challenge among themselves. Sophia lingered behind, approaching Thomas as he gathered his few belongings. "He's being unfair," she said. "Nobody could do what he's asking." Thomas shrugged. "Maybe, but I have to try." "Do you even have the sheet music?" she asked. He shook his head. "I'll borrow a recording from the library." Sophia frowned. "But you need the score to learn it properly." Thomas gave her a small smile. "I have my own way of learning." As he walked out of the academy that afternoon, rain soaking through his thin jacket, Thomas felt a curious mix of dread and determination. Professor Weber had meant to crush him with this impossible task, to prove once and for all that a poor boy from nowhere had no place among the elite. Musicians of the Vienna Academy. What the professor didn't know, what nobody at the academy knew, was that beneath Thomas's quiet exterior lay a gift so rare that even he didn't fully understand it. A gift that had been his secret companion since childhood, nurtured in solitude and hidden from the world. He had 1 week to prepare for the performance of his life. 1 week to either confirm everyone's low expectations or to show them exactly who Thomas Reiner really was, the small apartment Thomas shared with his elderly neighbor. Mrs. Petrovich was barely big enough for the two of them, but the old woman had offered him the spare room at a price he could afford when the academy's housing proved too expensive. The building was far from the glamorous districts of Vienna, nestled in a working-class neighborhood where factory workers and shopkeepers lived modest lives. "You look troubled, young man," Mrs. Petrovich said as Thomas entered that evening, his clothes still damp from the rain. "Bad day at your fancy school?" Thomas set his bag down and smiled weakly. "You could say that." Mrs. Petrovich, a retired seamstress with kind eyes and work-worn hands, had taken a motherly interest in the quiet boy from the countryside. She hobbled to the kitchen, her arthritis acting up in the damp weather. "Sit, I'll make tea." As the kettle whistled, Thomas stared out the window at the gray city skyline. He had 1 week. 7 days to learn a piece that professional pianists spent months perfecting. "Tell me," Mrs. Petrovich said, placing a steaming cup before him. Thomas sighed and explained Professor Weber's challenge. The old woman listened without interrupting, nodding occasionally. "This professor," she said when he finished, "he thinks he knows everything about you, yes? But he knows nothing." She tapped her temple with one finger. "Show him what's really in here." "But I don't even have a piano to practice on," Thomas said, the enormity of the task hitting him. Mrs. Petrovich smiled. "The church 2 streets over. Father Nikolai is my old friend. He will let you use their piano." An hour later, Thomas stood in the small neighborhood church. Father Nikolai, a round-faced man with a white beard, led him to a side room where an upright piano sat in the corner. "It's not much," the priest apologized, "not like what you have at your academy." But to Thomas it was perfect. "Thank you, Father. This means everything to me. You can come any time. I'm usually here until 9, and I'll give you a key for the side door." Father Nikolai patted his shoulder. "Mrs. Petrovich says you have a gift from God. I look forward to hearing it someday." Left alone, Thomas sat at the piano and closed his eyes. He had managed to borrow a recording of Rachmaninoff's Third from the Academy library before leaving. Now, with the small cassette player Mrs. Petrovich had lent him, he pressed play and listened. The complex, thundering notes filled the room. Most people heard beautiful music, but Thomas heard something more. He heard patterns, structures, relationships between notes that formed a map in his mind. His fingers twitched slightly as the music played, already beginning to trace the pathways of the piece. This had been his secret for as long as he could remember. Since childhood, he had been able to hear a piece of music, truly hear it, and then play it back with startling accuracy. His grandmother had discovered his gift when he was only 5, after hearing him perfectly replicate a complex folk tune on their neighbor's old piano, after hearing it just once at a village festival. With no money for formal lessons, his grandmother had done what she could. She borrowed recordings from the village library, found an old piano in the church, and let the boy play. By age 10, Thomas was playing Chopin and Beethoven by ear, having never learned to properly read music. When his grandmother passed away last year, Thomas had nearly given up on music altogether. But a visiting music teacher had heard him playing in the village church and secretly made a recording, which eventually found its way to the Vienna Academy. The scholarship that followed had seemed like a miracle, one that Professor Weber now seemed determined to revoke. Thomas listened to the recording 3 times through without touching the piano keys. He closed his eyes, letting the music wash over him, his mind breaking down its complex structure into pieces he could grasp. Only then did he place his hands on the keys and begin to play. The first attempts were halting and imperfect. The Rachmaninoff Third was notoriously difficult, with its rapid runs, complex rhythms, and enormous hand stretches. By midnight, when Father Nikolai gently reminded him of the time, Thomas had worked through barely the first 2 minutes of the piece. "Tomorrow," the priest said kindly, "music needs rest as much as practice." For the next 3 days, Thomas followed the same routine: classes at the academy during the day, where he endured knowing looks and whispers from classmates, then straight to the church to practice until midnight. He barely ate, barely slept. The music consumed him. By the 4th day, dark circles had formed under his eyes. In Professor Weber's class, he sat in the back as usual, but his exhaustion was noticeable. "Mr. Reiner," the professor called out, "you seem distracted today. Perhaps your special assignment is proving too difficult." A few students laughed nervously. "No, sir," Thomas replied quietly. "I'm just tired." Well, I hope for your sake that your fatigue is from productive practice and not from wasting time on a hopeless endeavor." After class, Sophia approached him in the hallway. "How's it going?" "With the Rachmaninoff." Thomas shrugged. "It's difficult. I could help," she offered. "I've studied it before. Not performed it, but I know the structure." Thomas hesitated. He had always worked alone, his unusual method of learning a closely guarded secret. But he was exhausted and time was running out. "Okay," he finally said. "Do you know where the practice rooms are in the East Building?" "The ones nobody uses because the pianos are out of tune?" Sophia nodded. "Meet me there at 4. That afternoon, in a dusty practice room with a slightly out-of-tune piano, Thomas showed Sophia his progress. He played the first 5 minutes of the concerto, and though there were mistakes and hesitations, the core of it was there, the skeleton of Rachmaninoff's masterpiece coming to life under his fingers. Sophia stared at him, her mouth slightly open. "That's incredible. You've learned that much in just 4 days?" Thomas stopped playing, suddenly self-conscious. "It's still rough. But how did you learn it so quickly? I don't even see any sheet music." Thomas looked down at the keys. "I listen. Then I play." "You mean you're playing by ear? The entire Rachmaninoff third?" He nodded. "But that's—" Sophia seemed at a loss for words. "Thomas, that's extraordinary. Most people can't even play Happy Birthday accurately by ear, let alone one of the most complex piano concertos ever written." Thomas shifted uncomfortably. "It's just how I've always learned. I never had formal training until now." Sophia sat beside him on the piano bench. "Show me." For the next 2 hours, they worked together. Sophia helped identify passages where Thomas's interpretation differed from the score, suggesting adjustments. But mostly she watched in amazement as he played increasingly longer sections from memory, his fingers finding notes he had never seen written down. "Why didn't you tell anyone you could do this?" she asked as they finally prepared to leave. Thomas gathered his few belongings. "At home it wasn't special. It was just how I played here. I thought it would make me seem even more different. Professor Weber already thinks I don't belong." "Professor Weber is about to have his mind changed," Sophia said with newfound confidence. The next 2 days passed in a blur of practice. Sophia brought him proper recordings, better than the library's scratchy cassette, and sat with him during lunch breaks, quizzing him on passages and offering encouragement. On the 6th day, something clicked. As Thomas played in the church that evening, the music finally flowed through him without resistance. His fingers found the keys effortlessly, the complex rhythms became second nature, and the emotional core of Rachmaninoff's masterpiece emerged from the old upright piano with surprising power. Father Nikolai, who had been listening from the doorway, entered when Thomas finished. "In all my years," the old priest said softly, "I have never heard such playing. Not even in the great concert halls." Thomas looked up, startled. He had been so absorbed in the music he hadn't noticed his audience. "Do you know what makes Rachmaninoff special?" Father Nikolai asked, sitting heavily in a nearby chair. "It's not just the notes, difficult as they are. It's the soul. Many pianists can play the notes, but few can play the soul." He pointed to Thomas's chest. "You play from here, young man. That cannot be taught." On the morning of the performance, Thomas woke early. He had barely slept, his mind still filled with cascading notes and complex harmonies. As he dressed in his best clothes, still shabby compared to his classmates' attire, Mrs. Petrovich handed him a small package wrapped in tissue paper. "For good luck," she said. Inside was a neatly folded white shirt, clearly new. "I can't accept this," Thomas began, knowing how little money the old woman had. "Nonsense. Every pianist needs a proper shirt." She straightened the collar as he put it on. "Now you look the part. Go show them who you really are." As Thomas walked to the academy that morning, the weight of the challenge ahead pressed on him. Yet alongside the nervousness was something new, a quiet confidence. For the first time since arriving in Vienna, he felt ready to reveal his true self. What awaited him in Professor Weber's classroom would either confirm his place at the academy or send him back to his village in disgrace. Either way, Thomas knew that today he would finally play with everything he had. No more hiding, no more holding back. Today the music would speak for him. The academy hallways buzzed with unusual excitement that morning. Word of the challenge had spread beyond Professor Weber's class, drawing curious students and even a few other teachers who lingered near the classroom door. Thomas kept his head down as he navigated through the crowd, the white shirt from Mrs. Petrovich crisp against his worn jacket. "Is that him?" he heard someone whisper. "The scholarship boy who's supposed to play Rachmaninoff? Poor kid. Weber's really done it this time. I heard he can barely read music." Thomas felt a gentle touch on his arm. Sophia stood beside him, her face bright with encouragement. "Don't listen to them," she said quietly. "Just remember what you showed me yesterday." Inside the classroom, chairs had been rearranged to create a performance space around the grand piano. Professor Weber stood at his desk, sorting through papers with deliberate slowness. though his eyes flicked toward the door when Thomas entered. "Ah, Mr. Reiner, you've decided to join us after all." The professor checked his watch, and with 2 minutes to spare. "How dedicated." Thomas said nothing as he took a seat in the back row. His hands felt cold and he rubbed them together, trying to warm his fingers. Around him, students settled in, some shooting him sympathetic glances, others looking merely curious. A few of the advanced students wore smug expressions, clearly expecting to witness a spectacular failure. At precisely 9 o'clock, Professor Weber cleared his throat. "As you all know, last week I gave Mr. Reiner a special assignment to prepare the first movement of Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 3 in D minor." He surveyed the room with a thin smile. "A piece that, as I explained, represents one of the most technically challenging works in the piano repertoire." The professor gestured toward the piano. "Mr. Reiner, the floor is yours, though I remind the class that my promise to excuse you from the term paper is contingent on Mr. Reiner achieving anything above complete failure, a bar I've intentionally set low out of fairness." A few nervous laughs rippled through the room. Thomas stood slowly, his heart hammering in his chest as he made his way to the piano. The gleaming black Steinway was far superior to the old upright at the church, and certainly better than the out-of-tune practice room piano. He adjusted the bench, feeling the smoothness of the polished wood beneath his fingers. Professor Weber held out a copy of the score. "You'll need this, I presume." Thomas hesitated, then shook his head. "No, thank you." "I don't need it," murmurs swept through the classroom. Professor Weber's eyebrows shot up. "You're going to play from memory? A piece you've had 1 week to learn?" "Yes, sir." The professor's mouth tightened into a thin line. "Very well. Whenever you're ready." Thomas placed his hands on the keys and closed his eyes. He took one deep breath, then another, letting the noise of the classroom fade away. In his mind, he heard his grandmother's voice. "Play like no one is watching. Tommy, play like it's just you and the music." His fingers struck the first notes, the haunting, deceptively simple opening theme that soon gives way to one of the most demanding piano works ever composed. For the first minute, the room remained silent, perhaps waiting for the inevitable stumble, the moment when the country boy would reveal his limitations. But that moment didn't come. As Thomas moved into the development section, his body swayed slightly with the music, his fingers finding their way through the labyrinth of notes with uncanny precision. The rich, romantic melodies filled the room, building in intensity as the piece progressed. When he reached the first major cadenza, a section of breathtaking difficulty where the piano plays alone in an extended showcase of virtuosity, a collective intake of breath was audible from the audience. Professor Weber had moved from his desk to stand closer, his arms folded across his chest, his expression unreadable as he watched Thomas's hands blur across the keyboard. The runs of notes cascaded perfectly, each phrase shaped with a musicality that seemed impossible for someone with so little formal training. 10 minutes into the performance, Thomas was no longer in the classroom. In his mind, he sat at the old church piano back home, his grandmother knitting quietly in the corner as he played. The music poured through him without effort now, his fingers simply the conduit for something larger than himself. He didn't see the door at the back of the classroom open, didn't notice the academy's director slip in with several other faculty members, drawn by reports of something extraordinary happening in Professor Weber's morning class. The first movement of the concerto builds to a powerful conclusion, demanding everything from the performer: technical brilliance, physical stamina, and emotional depth. As Thomas approached this finale, his face shone with a mixture of concentration and joy, completely absorbed in bringing Rachmaninoff's vision to life. The final chords resonated through the room, powerful and definitive. Then silence. Thomas opened his eyes, suddenly aware again of where he was. The classroom remained absolutely still. Professor Weber stood motionless, his face pale, lips slightly parted in astonishment. Then from the back of the room, someone began to clap. Others joined in, the applause growing until it filled the space. Students were standing, some wiping away tears, others shaking their heads in disbelief. Sophia beamed at him from her seat, mouthing the words, "You did it." Professor Weber raised a hand, and gradually the applause subsided. He approached the piano slowly, studying Thomas as if seeing him for the first time. "Mr. Reiner," he said, his voice lacking its usual sharpness. "Where did you learn to play like that?" Thomas swallowed. "My grandmother found me a piano in our village church, sir. I taught myself." "Taught yourself?" The professor repeated the words as if they made no sense. "And the Rachmaninoff, how did you learn it in a week?" "I listened to recordings. I can usually play what I hear." "Usually play what you—" Professor Weber turned to the class, then back to Thomas. "Do you mean to tell me you learned this entire movement by ear? Without sheet music?" Thomas nodded. A distinguished-looking man stepped forward from the back of the room, Director Hoffman, the head of the academy. Students straightened in their seats at his presence. "Young man," the director said, his deep voice carrying authority, "I've been listening from the back. In 30 years at this academy, I have never heard a student play that piece with such mastery, let alone a first-year student with 1 week's preparation." He turned to Professor Weber. "Anton, I believe we need to have a serious discussion about Mr. Reiner's program of study." Professor Weber nodded, still looking slightly dazed. "Yes, of course, Director." He cleared his throat. Class dismissed. "And, as promised, the term paper is canceled." A cheer went up from the students, who began gathering their things amid excited chatter. Many approached Thomas to offer congratulations, their previous indifference replaced with admiration and curiosity. Director Hoffman placed a hand on Thomas's shoulder. "Come to my office when you're finished here. We need to talk about your future at the academy." With a nod to Professor Weber, he left the room, followed by the other faculty members. As the classroom emptied, Thomas remained at the piano, still processing what had happened. Professor Weber lingered, straightening sheet music that didn't need straightening, clearly struggling with what to say. Finally, he looked up. "I owe you an apology, Mr. Reiner." Thomas shook his head. "You didn't know, sir. That's just it. I should have known. It's my job to recognize talent, to nurture it, not to—" He gestured vaguely. "I made assumptions about you based on your background, your circumstances. I was wrong." The professor ran a hand through his silver-streaked hair. "You have a rare gift. What we call perfect pitch, combined with exceptional memory and interpretive instinct. It's not something that can be taught." He hesitated. "But there are still things you need to learn. Your technique, while remarkably effective, is unorthodox, and you'll need to develop your music reading skills if you're to advance professionally." "I know, sir. I want to learn properly." Professor Weber nodded. "Then I would like to work with you. If you're willing to forgive my previous attitude." Before Tomas could respond, Sophia appeared at the doorway. "Sorry to interrupt, but Director Hoffman is waiting." She smiled at Thomas. "Everyone's talking about your performance. The third years are completely shocked." Professor Weber waved her in. "Miss Novak, perhaps you could accompany Mr. Reiner to the director's office? I suspect he could use a friendly face." As they left the classroom, Thomas felt lightheaded, the events of the morning still seeming unreal. In the hallway, students pointed and whispered as he passed. "Are you okay?" Sophia asked, noticing his dazed expression. "I think so. It's just a lot to take in," she laughed. "Well, get used to it. After what you just did, things are going to change around here." They walked in silence for a moment before Thomas spoke again. "Thank you for helping me. For believing I could do it." Sophia shook her head. "I didn't do anything. This was all you, Thomas." As they approached the director's office, Thomas thought of all the people who had helped him reach this moment. His grandmother, who had recognized his gift, Mrs. Petrovich, who had given him shelter, Father Nikolai, who had provided a piano, and now Sophia, who had offered friendship when no one else would. He had come to the academy feeling like an outsider, someone who didn't belong. For the first time, he allowed himself to hope that might no longer be true. "Ready?" Sophia asked as they reached the director's door. Thomas took a deep breath and nodded. Whatever came next, he would face it with the same determination that had carried him through Rachmaninoff's third. After all, that challenge had seemed impossible too. Director Hoffman's office was nothing like Thomas had imagined. Instead of the imposing, formal space he expected, the room felt almost cozy, with walls lined with bookshelves, old concert posters, and framed photographs of the director with famous musicians. A baby grand piano sat in the corner, its lid propped open. "Please, sit down." Director Hoffman gestured to the chairs in front of his desk. Sophia gave Tomas an encouraging smile before slipping out, closing the door quietly behind her. The director studied Tomas for a moment, his fingers steepled under his chin. "Do you know why the Rachmaninoff third is considered so difficult, Mr. Reiner?" Thomas shook his head. "It's not just the technical demands, the speed, the complex fingering, the enormous hand stretches. Many pieces have those challenges." The director leaned forward. "What makes it exceptional is that it requires both technical perfection and profound emotional understanding. Most pianists can achieve one or the other. Very few can manage both." He stood and walked to the window, gazing out at the academy courtyard. "You just played it with both. After 1 week of preparation, without sheet music." He turned back to Tomas. "In normal circumstances, I would find that impossible to believe." Tomas shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "I'm sorry if I broke any rules, sir." Director Hoffman laughed, a warm, genuine sound. "Broke rules? Young man, you just rewrote them." He returned to his desk and pulled out a folder. "I've been reviewing your application. Your situation is unusual. You have almost no formal training, yet your audition recording was extraordinary enough to earn you a full scholarship. Now I understand why." He opened the folder and glanced at the papers inside. "You have what we call perfect pitch, the ability to identify or reproduce any note by ear. Combined with an exceptional memory and interpretive instinct, these gifts are rare even among our most talented students." Thomas nodded slowly. "My grandmother always said I had a good ear." "A good ear," the director repeated with a smile. "That's like saying Mozart was quite musical." He closed the folder. "Here's what I propose. You clearly need a specialized program of study. Your gift for learning by ear is remarkable, but to succeed professionally, you'll need to develop your reading skills, understand music theory, and refine your technique. Professor Weber offered to work with me," Tomas said hesitantly. "Did he now?" Director Hoffman raised an eyebrow. "That's unexpected but fitting. Despite his traditional methods, Anton is one of our finest teachers." He made a note on a pad of paper. "I'll arrange private lessons with him 3 times a week, focusing on technique and theory." The director continued outlining a new schedule. Reduced group classes, additional time for practice, private instruction, and music reading. Thomas listened in amazement as his entire academy experience was being reshaped around his unique abilities. "There's one more thing," Director Hoffman said, his tone becoming more serious. "The academy hosts a donor concert at the end of each term. Our most promising students perform for the people who fund our scholarships." He fixed Thomas with a direct gaze. "I'd like you to play." Thomas's eyes widened. "In front of the donors? But that's usually for advanced students." "Yes, it is. But after what I heard today, I believe you're ready." The director smiled. "Besides, I think our benefactors should see what their money has made possible, don't you?" As Thomas left the office, his mind whirled with everything that had happened. Just 1 week ago, he had been the outsider, the scholarship student everyone expected to fail. Now the academy director was personally reshaping his education and inviting him to perform at a prestigious concert. Sophia was waiting in the hallway, pacing nervously. "How did it go?" she asked as soon as she saw him. "I'm still not sure," Thomas admitted. "Everything's changing so fast." As they walked through the academy, Thomas told her about the director's plans, the specialized program, the private lessons with Professor Weber, and the donor concert. "That's amazing," Sophia exclaimed. "The donor concert is a big deal. Only the best students get invited to play." "That's what scares me," Thomas said quietly. "What if the Rachmaninoff was just luck? What if I can't do it again?" Sophia stopped walking and turned to face him. "It wasn't luck. I watched you learn that piece in a week, remember? Nobody gets lucky playing Rachmaninoff." The next few weeks passed in a blur of new routines. Thomas's days were now filled with private lessons, specialized classes, and hours of practice. Professor Weber, true to his word, had transformed from harsh critic to dedicated mentor. Though still demanding, he approached Thomas with a new respect, tailoring his teaching to the boy's unique way of learning. "Your hands are doing the right things mostly by instinct," the professor explained during one lesson, gently adjusting Thomas's fingers on the keys. "But understanding why will make you even better. Theory isn't just rules. It's the grammar of what you already speak fluently." Thomas's living situation changed too. The academy found him a small room in the dormitory, closer to the practice facilities. Mrs. Petrovich cried when he told her he was moving out. "You'll visit an old woman sometimes?" she asked, pressing his hand between hers. "Of course," Tomas promised. "And you'll come to hear me play someday." "At your big concert?" "I would be too out of place." "No," Thomas insisted. "You'll be my special guest. I wouldn't be here without you." On Sundays, Thomas still went to Father Nikolai's church, playing the old upright after services. "To remember where I came from," he explained to Sophia when she asked why he didn't use the academy's better instruments. News of Thomas's extraordinary ability spread throughout the academy. Students who had once ignored him now watched him with curiosity, some with admiration, others with envy. A few of the most talented pianists seemed particularly bothered by his sudden rise. "They're just threatened," Sophia explained one afternoon as they noticed a group of third-year students whispering while watching Thomas practice. "You learned in a week what took them years." "I don't want anyone to resent me," Thomas said. "I didn't ask for this attention. Success always attracts both friends and critics. Just focus on the music." As the donor concert approached, Thomas worked tirelessly on his performance piece. Director Hoffman had suggested Liszt's Hungarian Rhapsody No. 2, showpiece that would highlight Thomas's technical abilities while being more familiar to the audience than Rachmaninoff. "It's still extremely challenging," Professor Weber cautioned during their lesson. "But after what you did with the Rachmaninoff, I have no doubts about your ability to master it." 2 days before the concert, as Thomas practiced late into the evening, the door to the practice room opened. A tall boy named Victor, one of the third-year students known for his arrogance, entered with 2 friends. "Still here? Don't you ever take a break?" Victor asked, his tone falsely casual. Thomas stopped playing. "I'm preparing for the concert." "Ah yes, the famous donor concert. Quite an honor for a first year." Victor leaned against the piano. "You know, some of us have worked for years to earn a spot in that concert." "I didn't ask for it," Thomas said quietly. "No? Then perhaps you should consider declining, out of respect for those with proper training." Victor's smile didn't reach his eyes. "After all, your little trick with the Rachmaninoff was impressive, but that's all it was. A trick. Playing by ear like a street musician." Thomas felt his face grow hot. "I should get back to practicing." "Of course," Victor straightened. "We wouldn't want to disturb the prodigy. Just something to think about." He and his friends left, closing the door with unnecessary force. Thomas stared at the keys, Victor's words echoing in his mind. Was it true? Was his ability just a parlor trick? Did he really deserve this opportunity when others had worked so traditionally for years? That night he couldn't sleep. By morning he had made a decision. He went straight to Director Hoffman's office. "I want to decline the performance spot," he said when the director invited him in. Director Hoffman frowned. "May I ask why?" "I don't think I've earned it." "Not really. There are third-year students who have worked much longer than I have." "I see." The director studied him carefully. "Did someone suggest this to you?" Thomas hesitated, then admitted, "Victor Kravitz said some things." "Ah." Understanding crossed the director's face. "And you believe Mr. Kravitz's assessment of your worthiness is more accurate than mine?" Put that way, it sounded foolish. Thomas looked down. "I just don't want people to think I'm getting special treatment." "Mr. Reiner, look at me." Director Hoffman's voice was gentle but firm. "You are getting special treatment. Because your talent is special. Extraordinary, in fact." He leaned forward. "Do you know how many students with perfect pitch and your natural ability I've encountered in 30 years at this academy?" Thomas shook his head. 3, including you." The director stood up and walked to the piano in the corner of his office. "Talent like yours is rare, but it's also fragile. Doubt, criticism, envy, these can destroy it before it has a chance to fully develop." He played a simple melody with one hand, then looked at Thomas. "The question isn't whether you deserve this opportunity. The question is what you'll do with it." He closed the piano lid. "So will you play at the concert?" Thomas took a deep breath. "Yes, sir. I will." The day of the concert arrived with a flurry of activity. The Academy's concert hall, normally used for faculty performances, had been prepared for the prestigious event. Flowers adorned the stage, programs were distributed, and students in formal attire guided donors to their seats. Backstage, Thomas peered through the curtain at the gathering crowd. Men and women in expensive clothes filled the front rows, Vienna's elite whose patronage kept the academy running. Among them he spotted Mrs. Petrovich looking slightly out of place in her best dress but beaming with pride, and Father Nikolai beside her. "Nervous?" Sophia asked, appearing beside him in a black concert dress. "Terrified," Thomas admitted. "Good. Professor Weber says a little fear keeps us sharp." She straightened his borrowed bow tie. "You look like a real concert pianist." "I don't feel like one." Sophia smiled. "After tonight, everyone else will think you are. Maybe then you'll believe it too." Director Hoffman approached, program in hand. "Mr. Reiner, you'll be closing the first half. A place of honor." He patted Thomas's shoulder. "Remember what we discussed? This isn't just about technique. It's about showing them your heart." As the concert began and other students performed, Thomas waited in the wings, his heart racing. He thought of his journey, from the village church with its out-of-tune piano to this moment. Of his grandmother who had recognized his gift. Of Mrs. Petrovich and Father Nikolai, who had helped him prepare for Professor Weber's challenge. Of Sophia's friendship and the director's belief in him. Whatever happened tonight, he was no longer hiding. No longer the outsider looking in. For better or worse, he had found his place in this world of music. The concert hall fell silent as Thomas walked onto the stage. The polished grand piano gleamed under the spotlights, its lid raised to project the sound to the farthest corners of the room. He bowed slightly to the audience, catching a glimpse of Mrs. Petrovich dabbing her eyes with a handkerchief. As Thomas took his seat at the piano, he remembered Professor Weber's final advice. Forget technique, forget the audience. Just tell your story through the music. He placed his hands on the keys and began to play Liszt's Hungarian Rhapsody No. 2. The familiar opening notes rang clear and confident, building gradually from the solemn introduction to the playful dance-like sections. His fingers moved with precision, but tonight there was something more, a warmth and personality that transformed the technical showpiece into something deeply personal. In the third row, Professor Weber leaned forward in his seat, watching his student with newfound pride. Next to him, Director Hoffman nodded approvingly as Thomas navigated the challenging runs and trills with both technical skill and genuine feeling. As the piece progressed to its more demanding sections, Thomas found himself transported back to the village church, playing for no one but himself and his grandmother. The music flowed from some deep well within him, his fingers finding not just the right notes but the right emotions. The fiery, passionate melody spoke of his journey, the struggles, the doubts, and finally the triumph. When he reached the famous Friska section, the fast, virtuosic finale that tests even the most accomplished pianists, Thomas didn't think about the technical challenges. Instead, he thought about everything that had brought him to this moment. His grandmother's belief in him, Mrs. Petrovich's kindness, Father Nikolai's generosity, Sophia's friendship, Professor Weber's teaching, and Director Hoffman's trust. The final chords resonated through the hall, powerful and defiant. For a moment, complete silence followed. Then the audience erupted in applause. People rose to their feet, their enthusiasm building as Thomas stood and bowed, his face flushed with exertion and emotion. From his position on stage, he could see Mrs. Petrovich crying openly now, Father Nikolai beaming beside her. Professor Weber was applauding with unusual vigor, and Sophia, watching from the wings, gave him a thumbs up. As the applause continued, Director Hoffman joined Thomas on stage, raising a hand to quiet the audience. "Ladies and gentlemen," the director began, "what you've just witnessed is precisely why your support of the Academy is so vital. Thomas Reiner came to us just 3 months ago on a full scholarship, from a small village where he taught himself to play on a church piano." He placed a hand on Thomas's shoulder. "Without your generosity, extraordinary talents like his might never be discovered or developed." After the concert, a reception was held in the Academy's grand foyer. Wealthy patrons mingled with faculty and selected students, sipping champagne and discussing the performances. Thomas found himself surrounded by people eager to meet the young pianist who had stolen the show. "Extraordinary performance, young man," said an elegant older woman wearing an impressive diamond necklace. "You must have been playing since you were very young." "Yes, ma'am," Thomas replied politely, "though I had no formal training until I came here." "No formal training?" She looked astonished. "How remarkable." And who is your teacher now? Professor Weber, Thomas said, glancing across the room where the professor was engaged in conversation with several donors. Anton Weber? The woman raised her eyebrows. He rarely takes first-year students. You must be special indeed. As the woman moved on, Sophia appeared at his side, offering a glass of juice. You're the star of the night, she said with a smile. Everyone's talking about you. It doesn't feel real, Thomas admitted, taking a sip. 3 months ago, I was playing on an out-of-tune piano in my village. And now? He gestured to the opulent surroundings and well-dressed crowd. Now you're where you belong, she finished for him. Across the room, Thomas spotted Victor and his friends watching him with barely concealed resentment. But tonight their jealousy couldn't touch him. He had proven himself not just to them, but more importantly, to himself. Director Hoffman approached, accompanied by a distinguished-looking couple. Thomas, I'd like you to meet Mr. and Mrs. Volkov. They're interested in sponsoring an advanced student. The couple greeted Thomas warmly, asking about his background and training. As they talked, Mrs. Volkov mentioned that they owned a small concert hall and hosted regular recitals. We would be honored if you would consider performing at our spring series, she said. It's a wonderful opportunity for promising musicians to gain performance experience. Thomas looked at Director Hoffman in surprise. The director nodded encouragingly. I would be delighted, Thomas replied, trying to sound more confident than he felt. As the evening progressed, Mrs. Petrovich and Father Nikolai finally managed to make their way through the crowd to reach him. My boy, Mrs. Petrovich said, embracing him with tears in her eyes. Your grandmother would have been so proud. She is proud, Father Nikolai said gently. I'm certain she heard every note from heaven. Thomas swallowed the lump in his throat. I wouldn't be here without both of you. Thank you for everything. Mrs. Petrovich patted his cheek. You did all the hard work. We just provided a piano and a place to sleep. And belief, Thomas added, when I didn't believe in myself. Later that night, as the reception wound down, Professor Weber found Thomas standing alone by one of the tall windows, looking out at the city lights. Quite a change from a week ago, isn't it? The professor said, joining him. Thomas nodded. Everything's happening so fast. Success often does. Professor Weber studied him thoughtfully. But remember, tonight is just the beginning. The path ahead will have its own challenges. What kind of challenges? The professor smiled slightly. You've conquered the technical mountains that defeat most pianists. Your next challenge will be finding your own voice, your own interpretation, not just playing beautifully, but saying something meaningful through your music. Thomas considered this. And you'll help me? As much as I can. Professor Weber turned to face him directly. But first, we need to discuss your summer plans. Director Hoffman and I have been talking. Summer plans? The International Young Pianists Workshop in Salzburg. It's highly selective. Only 12 students from around the world. Director Hoffman has nominated you. Thomas's eyes widened. But I've only been studying formally for a few months. Surely there are more qualified students. There are more traditionally trained students, Professor Weber corrected. But qualified? That's what your audition will determine. Audition? Thomas felt a flutter of anxiety. In 2 months, you'll need to prepare 3 pieces from different periods, classical, romantic, and contemporary. The professor's expression grew serious. It will require intensive work far beyond what you've done so far. Do you think I'm ready? Thomas asked quietly. Professor Weber considered the question carefully. I think you have the ability. The rest depends on your commitment. 2 days later, Thomas received a letter from his village. His friend Pavel wrote that the local newspaper had somehow learned of his success at the academy and published a story about the village boy turned piano prodigy. The entire community was following his progress with pride. Your grandmother's old house remains empty, Pavel wrote. The village council has decided to preserve it in your honor. Some even talk of establishing a music scholarship in your name for other children here who show promise. Thomas read the letter several times, emotions washing over him in waves. He had left the village feeling like an outsider, someone who didn't belong. Now it seemed he had become a source of inspiration. Spring arrived in Vienna, bringing new opportunities and challenges. Thomas maintained his rigorous schedule, classes, private lessons, hours of practice while preparing for both the Volkov's recital and the Salzburg audition. Some days were exhilarating, others exhausting. There were moments of doubt when the pressure seemed overwhelming, but each time, Tomas found strength in remembering how far he had come. The recital at the Volkov's concert hall was a success, leading to more invitations. Word spread through Vienna's musical circles about the remarkable young pianist at the Academy. Critics attended his performances, writing favorable reviews that described him as a fresh voice in classical piano and a natural talent of rare depth. As the date for the Salzburg audition approached, Thomas worked tirelessly on his 3 selected pieces: Mozart's Sonata in A Major, Chopin's Ballade No. 1, and a contemporary piece by a living composer. A challenging work that Professor Weber had suggested to showcase Thomas's versatility. The night before the audition, Thomas couldn't sleep. He slipped out of the dormitory and made his way to one of the practice rooms, intending to run through his pieces one more time. To his surprise, he found Sophia there, also practicing late. "Nervous about tomorrow?" she asked when he entered. "Terrified," he admitted. Sophia closed her music book. "Remember when Professor Weber first challenged you with the Rachmaninoff? You were terrified then too. This feels different. The Salzburg workshop, it's international. The best young pianists from everywhere. And now you're one of them," Sophia said simply. Thomas sat on the bench beside her. "What if I'm not good enough? What if everything so far has been luck or novelty? People impressed by my story rather than my playing?" Sophia thought for a moment. "Play something for me. Not your audition pieces. Something that means something to you." Thomas considered, then began to play a simple folk melody, one his grandmother had taught him when he was very young. The tune was uncomplicated but beautiful, full of nostalgia and quiet joy. As he played, he added harmonies and variations, transforming the simple song into something richer, but never losing its essential character. When he finished, Sophia was quiet for a long moment. "That's why you'll succeed," she finally said. "Because even when you play the most complex pieces, that honesty comes through. That's not technique or training. That's you." The next day, Thomas performed his audition for the international jury with a newfound calm. He played not to impress them with technique, but to share what the music meant to him, its stories, its emotions, its questions and answers. 2 weeks later, a letter arrived bearing the Salzburg workshop seal. Thomas opened it with trembling fingers, Professor Weber and Director Hoffman waiting anxiously in the director's office. His eyes scanned the page, then looked up, a smile spreading across his face. "I'm in," he said simply. Professor Weber clasped his shoulder. "I never doubted it." That evening, Thomas walked through the Academy's grounds as the setting sun bathed the buildings in golden light. In just a few months, his life had transformed completely. The path ahead would be challenging. Salzburg, more advanced studies. Eventually a professional career, but for the first time, he truly believed he belonged in this world. He thought of his grandmother and whispered a silent thank you to her for recognizing what he couldn't see in himself. He thought of Mrs. Petrovich, Father Nikolai, Sophia, Professor Weber, and Director Hoffman, each of them seeing potential in him when he was ready to give up. The poor boy with the extraordinary gift was no longer hiding. The music that had always lived inside him now had a chance to reach the world, and that, Thomas realized, was the greatest gift of all.